Usually when we think about military strategy, we conceptualize it as a fairly straightforward transaction.
Right, like a direct action and reaction.
Exactly. You have a threat, a weapons depot, a bunker, maybe a bridge. You drop the ordnance, you eliminate the target, and, well, that's the end of the exchange.
Yeah, it's binary in the classic sense of warfare. The asset is either operational or it's been neutralized.
Right, the intent is entirely focused on the target itself.
Yeah.
But I was reading through the source material for today's deep dive, and it opens with this description of a specific, frankly, deeply unsettling military tactic.
Oh, yeah, the one from the drone wars.
Yeah, the drone wars in the tribal districts of Pakistan. It's colloquially known as the double tap. And it fundamentally rewrites that whole binary logic we just talked about.
It really does. It changes the entire math of the strike.
Right, because a missile strikes a target, say, a house or a vehicle. But that initial explosion isn't the end of the transaction. It's just the setup.
The bait, essentially.
Exactly. After that first strike, there's a pause. A highly calibrated, intentional interval of time where absolutely nothing happens.
And that interval, mathematically speaking, is the entire point of the operation.
Right, because what happens when a building collapses in a residential neighborhood?
People come running.
The people who care come running. The neighbors, the fathers, the brothers, the local ambulance workers.
Yeah.
Human nature dictates that they run into the dust and the rubble.
Frantic digging with their bare hands.
Digging to pull out the wounded. And right at that moment, when they are completely exposed, deeply engaged in the act of rescuing a second missile, strikes those exact same coordinates.
The psychology of it is just devastating. I mean, we actually have extensive data on this.
Yeah, the 2012 study, right.
Right. It was a joint study conducted by clinics at Stanford and NYU. They sent researchers into Pakistan to actually interview the survivors of these campaigns.
And what they found was wild.
It was. What they documented wasn't just, physical trauma. They documented a total behavioral reengineering of the population.
Because the goal of the double tap wasn't simply to double the body count in the rubble.
Not at all. The goal was to kill the rescuer inside the mind of every single person watching from the perimeter.
Humanitarian workers actually told the researchers they had to institute mandatory delays before they could even approach a strike site.
Right, they couldn't just rush in anymore.
No. Fathers literally learned that if their home was hit, they had to stand at the edge of the smoldering crater for hours. Sometimes, and this is horrific, sometimes listening to the voices of their own families trapped inside.
Because the price of running in had been demonstrated so brutally.
You were basically describing the purest form of deterrence.
Yeah, it teaches a lesson that absolutely no counterargument can touch.
Right.
The mangled dead from that second strike serve a didactic purpose. They're a lesson published in blood, right, where every potential Samaritan is forced to read it.
And once that lesson is learned by the population, you don't even need to drop a third or fourth missile. The deterrence becomes entirely self-sustaining.
Exactly. The men standing at the perimeter aren't cowards. They are making a deeply rational, agonizing calculation based on a systemic punishment.
It makes me think of an invisible, psychological, electric fence.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. Because if you want to keep a dog in a yard, you don't actually need to shock the dog every single day.
No, you just have to shock him once, incredibly violently, in front of all the other dogs.
Exactly. After they witness that, they internalize the boundary. You could literally unplug the fence for a decade, and the dogs will still pace anxiously inside the line, policing themselves.
And that concept, the internalization of the electric fence, is the structural foundation of the massive, highly provocative essay we are unpacking today for you.
Yes, let's get into the mission for this deep dive. We are examining a staggering piece of work by Stephen Sears' work titled Killing the Rescuer.
It's a dense read.
Extremely dense. But work's entire thesis is that Western civilization has taken this exact dynamic, the deterrence of the rescuer, the double tap, and applied it to our own sociological structure.
Right. He argues that over the last 3 generations, the West has subjected its protector class to this.
Which he defines as traditional fathers, elders, community volunteers, right?
Exactly. He says they've been subjected to a systemic administrative second strike, which has completely deterred them from their societal roles.
Which is why, according to the author, we are witnessing a mass withdrawal of men from traditional obligations today.
It takes phenomena that we often diagnose as, individual moral failures.
Like the modern crisis of young men failing to launch.
Right, or the total collapse of marriage rates. And it reframes them as the highly predictable outcomes of a systemic deterrence campaign.
Now, before we go a single step further, I need to pause and speak directly to you, the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
The source material we were exploring today contains highly politically charged content. This essay touches on feminism, welfare reform, family court, sociology.
It bridges deeply controversial topics across both left-wing and right-wing political spheres.
So I want to be perfectly clear. We are not taking any sides today. We are not endorsing Stephen Sears' work's viewpoints, nor are we declaring his historical interpretations as absolute truth.
Our only job as your guides on this deep dive is to neutrally unpack the fascinating, incredibly complex arguments contained in this original text.
Exactly, so you can fully understand the author's perspective. Decide for yourself what you think of it.
And the value in understanding this perspective, honestly, regardless of your personal politics, is profound.
Totally, whether you are a parent trying to navigate raising resilient kids, someone exhausted by the modern dating market, or just, an observer of the shifting dynamics in our communities.
This essay offers a structural, historical lens. It forces you to ask, are the social changes we are seeing just natural evolution, or are they the result of invisible administrative architecture?
Okay, so let's unpack this. How do we get from a literal drone strike in the tribal regions of Pakistan to the modern American family? That seems like an impossible leap.
It does, but to bridge that gap, the author insists we have to look at history.
He claims this isn't just a modern Western anomaly, right?
Right. To prove his point, he takes us back to the first time a modern government attempted to systematically erase the family unit.
We are going to a real-world laboratory. Soviet Russia, starting in 1917.
The author uses the Bolshevik Revolution as his baseline for a very specific reason.
Because before the Western administrative state ever assembled its own policies regarding the household, the full program of dismantling the family was run at state power by ideological true believers.
Exactly. And crucially, they published their methodology and their results for the world to see.
The text points out that when the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they weren't just aiming to reorganize the factories or the farms.
No, they wanted to fundamentally re-engineer human relationships from the ground up, based on Marxist theory.
Specifically, they leaned heavily on Friedrich Engels, right?
Yes. Engels published a seminal work back in 1884 arguing that the monogamous family was basically the primal property institution.
In his view, the family was the original class antagonism.
Right. The husband was the bourgeois owner, and the wife was the proletariat.
Work notes that Engels projected this utopian future. He theorized that once the means of production were in common hands, once private property was abolished, the traditional household would just dissolve naturally.
The care, feeding, and education of children would become a purely public, communal affair.
The family, having lost its economic rationale, would just wither away. And the Bolsheviks didn't treat this as some vague philosophical musing, did they?
No, they treated it as a falsifiable scientific hypothesis. They wrote that prediction directly into their legal code to run the experiment.
It's wild how fast they moved. By December 1917, mere weeks after taking power, they secularized marriage completely.
And they made divorce available at the simple unilateral request of either spouse.
Which, you have to remember the context here. This is a country where marriage had been a deeply religious, indissoluble, orthodox sacrament for nearly 1,000 years.
Right, it was foundational to the culture.
To introduce unilateral divorce overnight, that is a civilization-level shock to the system.
But that was just the preamble. 10 months later, they implement the Family Code of October 1918.
Drafted by a young, radical jurist named Alexander Goikhberg.
Right, and the essay details how the authors of this code didn't hide their intentions at all. They stated openly in their commentaries that the family was a transitional, obsolete phenomenon scheduled to disappear.
The legal changes were sweeping. Illegitimacy was abolished as a legal category entirely. Inheritance was completely abolished.
But here's the detail in the text that actually made me stop reading.
The adoption thing.
Yes, adoption was strictly prohibited, banned.
Look, I have to push back on the author's framing here, or at least play devil's advocate for a second. Banning adoption sounds almost cartoonishly evil.
It sounds insane to our modern ears.
Right. Why on earth would a revolutionary government, one claiming to be acting for the liberation of the people, legally ban families from taking in orphans? What is the logic there?
The author explains that it wasn't mustache-twirling villainy to them, it was absolute ideological purity.
You have to view it through the lens of a totalitarian utopian.
Precisely. If the state is meant to be the ultimate parent, and the state collective is the ultimate provider, Allowing a traditional family to adopt a child undermines the entire premise of the revolution.
Because it admits the state isn't enough.
Exactly. To permit a family to absorb a parentless child is to permit an obsolete, bourgeois institution to perform the very function that the state was trying to monopolize.
The state was a jealous god.
They banned the corporal work of mercy in advance, entirely on theory, because they believed the communal nurseries would render private adoption reactionary.
And they had incredibly famous champions selling this to the public. The essay highlights Alexandra Kollontai.
She was a fascinating historical figure, head of the Zahnärzte, the women's department.
Arguably the most famous woman in the revolution. In 1920, she published a pamphlet called Communism in the Family.
And Work quotes her directly, and the rhetoric is just wild.
She addresses wives who might be frightened by the new easy divorce laws, telling them that a woman must accustom herself to seek support in the collective, not from the individual man.
She literally declared the family merely a hindrance.
She went even further regarding children. The text notes she gave specific instructions on how mothers should view their own offspring.
Right. She wrote that a mother must learn not to differentiate between yours and mine.
She must remember that there are only our children, the children of Russia's communist workers.
And in that same year, 1920, the text points out that Soviet Russia became the first state in the modern world to legalize abortion.
So you look at the protocol they established. Marriage is entirely optional and easily dissolved. Inheritance is gone, adoption is a crime, and the state assumes the role of the ultimate parent.
They built the laboratory.
So, according to the author, what happened when they turned the machine on?
The essay describes the result as complete sociological devastation.
It's fast, too.
Incredibly fast.
Yeah.
Within just a few years, the data came rolling in. By 1925, the Soviet Union had the highest divorce rate of any country in Europe.
In Moscow, the epicenter of the experiment, there was one divorce for every 2 marriages.
And Work argues that the freedom they promised women ended up being a catastrophic trap.
Because men quickly realized the new rules of the game. A man could just register a marriage, cohabitate for a season, unilaterally register a divorce, and move to the next town.
Serial abandonment didn't just happen, it became a legally recognized and widely utilized strategy.
And those abandoned women who were holding the children, they had been promised that the state collective would catch them.
But the communal dining halls, the pristine state nurseries, the collective support networks, they largely only existed in Kollontai's pamphlets.
The state successfully dissolved the marital bond, but it completely failed to build the infrastructure required to replace the security that bond had provided.
Which created a horrifying historical spectacle that the author spends significant time on.
The Bezprizorniki,
Yes.
the unattended ones.
Feral orphans. And we aren't talking about a few kids in an orphanage. The essay describes ragged columns of starving, homeless children roaming the Russian countryside and the cities.
Estimates range between 4.5 and 7 million children. Millions of kids living in train stations, forming gangs, surviving through theft and prostitution.
Now, to be fair, the author is careful to provide context here. He acknowledges that the 1918 Family Code didn't create all of these orphans in a vacuum.
Right. World War I, the violence of the Revolution, the brutal Civil War, and the catastrophic famine of 1921 created a massive baseline of displaced children.
However, Work argues that the Marxist doctrine did 3 specific things to heavily exacerbate the catastrophe.
First, it met a world historical crisis of orphans with that adoption ban in full force.
When the country was flooding with starving children, families with the means to help were legally forbidden from throwing them a lifeline. The ideology legally mandated the abandonment.
The state claimed the monopoly on care, and when it couldn't provide the care, it still refused to break the monopoly.
Second, the serial divorce phenomenon manufactured a constant fresh stream of destitute kids, pushing them out onto the streets when mothers simply couldn't feed them.
And third, when state policies like forced agricultural collectivization in the 1930s created even more orphans, the government solved the public relations problem by simply ceasing to record the data.
They disconnected the instrument that was giving them the bad readings.
But even a totalitarian state can't ignore demographic collapse forever. The essay outlines how, by 1926, the regime starts quietly retreating.
They restore adoption, actively encouraging peasant families to take in orphans because the state system was collapsing under the weight.
They restore inheritance. Piece by piece, they start buying back the exact capacities of the traditional family they had tried to price at zero just a few years earlier.
The true climax of this grand experiment happens in 1936. Stalin's government was looking at the demographic data.
Specifically the falling birth rates.
Exactly. And they weren't looking at it through a lens of morality or family values. They were measuring their future in terms of military manpower and industrial labor battalions.
And the numbers spelled doom. So on June 27, 1936, they ruthlessly and abruptly reversed course.
The name of the decree is incredibly ironic. It was called In Defense of Mother and Child.
They completely ban abortion. They make divorce incredibly expensive and bureaucratically difficult to obtain.
They attach severe criminal penalties to unpaid alimony.
And the consolidation of 1944 goes even further. Divorce returns to open court. You literally had to publish your intent to divorce in the local newspaper at your own expense.
Illegitimacy, which they had proudly abolished in 1918 as a bourgeois superstition, is fully restored to the legal clerk.
Think about the whiplash. The state that told everyone marriage was just a temporary, meaningless concession ended up printing your divorce in the paper to publicly shame you.
It's a complete 180.
And I found this part of the text absolutely mind-blowing, what happened to the architects of the original plan, the people who designed the 1918 code.
Oh, Stalin didn't just reverse their policies, he liquidated the planners.
Yes. Alexander Goikhbarg, the jurist who drafted the 1918 code and wrote that marriage was basically a set of fetters, was eventually thrown into a psychiatric asylum by the regime.
Nikolai Krylenko, a principal legal theorist of the early revolution, was arrested, subjected to a show trial, and shot.
So, Work uses this entire history to establish a baseline. He argues this is a cold, scientific finding.
A totalitarian regime, completely unconstrained by morality, religion, or custom, operating with a completely blank slate, figured out in just 18 years that could not dispense with the family.
They reimposed it purely on instrumental survival grounds. They realized the family is not just some arbitrary property artifact you can replace with a state-issued check or a communal nursery.
But here's the critical pivot of the essay, the transition to the West. Work asks a penetrating question. Who watched the Soviet experiment fail?
Because Western intellectuals were absolutely watching.
You feel like the Webbs from England toured the Soviet laboratory in its early days. But instead of seeing a failed experiment that proved the inescapable necessity of the traditional family, radical thinkers in the West looked at the rubble and concluded the exact opposite.
The essay points to Shulamith Firestone, a major radical feminist thinker. In 1970, she explicitly wrote about the Russian communes in her book, The Dialectic of Sex.
And according to Work, she didn't look at the millions of feral orphans and the societal collapse and say, wow, abolishing the family is a catastrophic idea.
No, she said the Soviet experiment failed because their attempts were half-hearted.
Half-hearted. It's an astonishing grading of history. After the postcard divorces, the adoption bans, the demographic freefall, and the literal execution of the architects, she graded the effort as insufficiently thorough.
The author notes that this is the danger of an ideology that recognizes no standard outside of itself. It can never receive failure as a refutation.
Failure just registers as a mandate to try again, but to push harder.
Which brings us to how this exact ideological experiment came to the West. Work's thesis is that it didn't arrive by sudden government decree like it did in Russia. There was no violent revolution.
Instead, it arrived through intellectual framing in 3 distinct cultural installments.
The author argues that before society can systematically remove a protector class, the fathers, the elders, you have to destroy their reputation.
You have to pathologize them. You have to convince the society that the protector is actually an oppressor.
Let's unpack the 3 installments Work identifies. First, in 1950, you have a massive, highly influential work of social psychology called The Authoritarian Personality, produced under Theodor Adorno and others.
This wasn't some fringe academic paper. It had massive institutional backing.
And Work argues that this book scientifically pathologized traditional paternal authority. It framed the hierarchical family discipline of the traditional patriarch as the psychological seedbed of fascism.
I want you to think about the structural brilliance of that frame. It is entirely unfalsifiable.
Because under this psychological model, if a father demands deference or sets strict rules, he exhibits the authoritarian syndrome.
But if the father objects to the diagnosis, if he says, no, I'm just trying to raise disciplined kids, that defensiveness is also scored as a marker of the syndrome.
Right. I was reading this and thinking, it's a giant societal Kafka trap.
It really is.
If a father defends his authority, his defensiveness is used by the psychologists as empirical proof that he is dangerously rigid. He literally cannot win the argument because his participation in the argument is viewed as a symptom of his disease.
Exactly. Then comes the second installment, The essay jumps to 1970 and points to Margaret Mead. At the time, Mead was arguably the most famous credentialed voice in the human sciences in America.
She publishes Culture and Commitment.
In it, she essentially declares that the age of the elder is formally over. She argues that the modern world is changing too fast, technologically and socially, for any adult to possess usable, transferable knowledge for the youth.
Work points out how subtle and damaging this is. The wisdom of the grandfather, the elder statesman, the community mentor isn't empirically refuted.
It is just reclassified as obsolete in advance. The youth are told they have nothing to teach you.
And then the third installment, also in 1970, is Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, which we mentioned earlier.
Unlike Mead or Adorno, Firestone doesn't use euphemisms. The author shows how she explicitly names the biological family itself as the root of all human oppression.
Beneath class, beneath property, beneath race.
And calls for its outright abolition.
So you look at the sequence. The father is pathologized in 1950. The elder is obsoleted in 1970. The biological family is targeted as the enemy in 1970.
Work calls this process poisoning the well.
He traces the phrase back to a famous 1864 dispute between the novelist Charles Kingsley and Cardinal John Henry Newman.
Kingsley publicly stated that truth had never been a virtue for the Roman clergy, pointing specifically at Newman.
Newman realized the trap immediately.
Yeah.
If you declare a man a liar before he even opens his mouth to speak, any defense he offers arrives pre-discounted. The audience views his defense as just more proof of his deception.
It's a mechanism of reputational destruction.
To put it in modern terms, it's like an autoimmune disease. The intellectuals convinced the cultural body that his own protective cells, the traditional fathers and elders, were actually a pathogen.
So the society began attacking its own immune system. The essay connects this to modern psychological research by Heinz Lehmann on mobbing in the workplace.
Mobbing isn't open, direct bullying where someone shouts in your face. It's highly covert.
It starts by painting the target as difficult, toxic, or unstable to the rest of the office before the target even knows there's a conflict.
Right. The ground is prepared in advance. So when the target eventually realizes they're being marginalized or attacked, and they react with justifiable anger or distress, the mob doesn't have to defend its actions.
The mob just points and says to the audience, "See, we told you he was unstable." The target's own bewildered defensive reactions supply all the evidence the mob needs to justify the exclusion.
Work argues that Western society executed a mobbing campaign against the category of fatherhood on a civilizational scale. The traditional father was framed as a proto-fascist oppressor, so any attempt he made to defend his role was viewed as toxic defensiveness.
It's incredibly bleak when you lay it out like that.
It is. But as I was reading the essay, I hit a timeline issue that really confused me. I want to see if we can untangle it.
Okay, what's the issue?
The author says the intellectual frame, Mead and Firestone in 1970, poisoned the well. But a psychological frame, no matter how powerful, doesn't physically empty households. Books don't evict men from homes.
Right, ideas need mechanisms.
For the frame to become a physical reality, it needed an executioner. It needed a mechanism with the power to separate the man from his family. Work points to the American welfare state's accounting department as that executioner.
The ledger.
Exactly. But the bureaucratic policies he cites, like the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, started way back in 1935. And the home raids he details happened in 1963. That's before the 1970 intellectual frame. How does that causal timeline make sense?
That is an incredibly astute observation, and it's vital to understanding Work's actual argument about how bureaucracies function. The ledger, the accounting system, predated the intellectual frame.
So it was already running.
The bureaucracy was already grinding away, blindly following its own internal mathematics. What the intellectual frame provided in the 1960s and 70s was the immunization for the ledger.
What do you mean by immunization?
Think about it. When the bureaucratic ledger started producing massive societal damage, when it started visibly breaking apart families in the 1960s, society should have recoiled.
People should have said, stop the machine.
But the intellectuals arrived with the frame and said, actually, the traditional family is an oppressive, authoritarian structure anyway. It's a good thing it's dissolving. The frame protected the machine from criticism. The intellectuals provided the retroactive moral justification for what the accountants were already doing blindly.
Okay, wow, that makes perfect sense. The machine was running, and the intellectuals convinced society not to pull the plug. So let's look at that machine. Let's look at the mathematics of the executioner.
The author dives deep into the mechanics of Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC. As you noted, it started in 1935 as a relatively modest pension designed primarily for widows.
But as it expanded through the post-war decades, a definitional quirk in the accounting hardened into a brutal arithmetic.
The benefit unit, the entity receiving the money, was strictly defined as the mother and her children. The father was definitionally excluded from the unit.
And work shows how this wasn't just a passive exclusion. In state after state, the presence of an able-bodied man in the house mathematically reduced or completely extinguished the family's financial grant.
The author states this beautifully and tragically. The father was assigned a negative price.
I want to linger on that concept, a negative price. His literal physical presence cost the household money. Conversely, his departure was a payable event.
The state created a system where they would financially reward the physical removal of the father. Work points out the dark irony here.
Yeah, that no Soviet drafter in 1918 wrote a provision more doctrinally effective at dissolving the family than this.
And in America, it was administered by sincere, mild-mannered clerks who were just diligently following the eligibility rules in their binders.
But when you create a massive financial incentive like that, you have to police it. People will try to game the system to keep both the father and the money.
Human nature again.
And this need to police the ledger leads to some of the darkest, most dystopian moments in American administrative history. The essay details an event called Operation Bed Check.
January 13th, 1963, Alameda County, California.
6:30 in the morning on a Sunday. Teams of social workers fan out across Oakland. They work in pairs. One knocks on the front door, the other covers the back door to catch any men trying to escape out the window.
They were conducting mass raids on the homes of welfare mothers, completely without warrants.
And the primary purpose, as stated plainly in the operational records, was to find unauthorized males. What's even worse is that the records show the majority of the homes raided were selected specifically because the occupants were under absolutely no suspicion of fraud.
The administration just wanted to prove to the public and the politicians that its overall caseload was clean.
The essay highlights a social worker named Benny Max Parrish. He read the operation order and refused to participate, arguing correctly that it was a blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment.
He was fired for insubordination. When he appealed his firing, the Intermediate Appellate Court upheld his termination. And the language the judge used is chilling.
The judge stated that public funds must not be siphoned off by unauthorized males, regardless of the pleasures this may afford the mothers.
The author zeroes in on that quote because it exposes the underlying theory of the program stated openly by a judge. The state's financial grant had essentially purchased the mother's bed, and the state was going to violently police that purchase.
It's like the state became an invasive, jealous husband.
Exactly. Socialist feminist scholars in the early 1980s actually looked at this dynamic and clinically described it as a shift from private patriarchy to public patriarchy.
The state assumed the role of the provider and the supervisor.
But it was a marriage completely devoid of affection, mercy, or forgiveness. It wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court of California struck down the Parrish firing, and the 1968 King v. Smith Supreme Court case finally ended the substitute father rules that prompted the raids.
But Wolf points out that while the unconstitutional raids stopped, the underlying math remained. The negative price on the father was just shifted into different columns.
It was threaded through the earned income credit, medical assistance eligibility, and public housing rules. The deterrence was moved from early morning raids into actuarial tables.
And then the author asks, what did the state do to the fathers it successfully priced out of the home? It didn't just leave them alone, it turned them into a revenue stream. Work details the passage of the Bradley Amendment in 1986.
This part of the essay is infuriating.
Explain how the Bradley Amendment works, because it sounds like a modern-day debtor's prison.
It functions very similarly. Under the Bradley Amendment, if a non-custodial father, often poor and unemployed, cannot pay his assessed child support, those arrears accrue as final legal judgments the exact moment they fall due.
And the kicker is, they can never be retroactively modified or forgiven by a judge.
Not if the man loses his job, not if he becomes severely disabled, not even if he is imprisoned. The debt is immortal.
And the essay points out a brutal administrative reality. In many states, if the mother and kids are on public assistance, The child support collected from the father doesn't even go to the child.
No, it goes directly to the state to reimburse the government for the welfare payments.
The father is literally taxed to defray the cost of the bureaucratic program that priced him out of his own home in the first place.
And how do they enforce this unpayable debt? They suspend his driver's license.
Which, in most of America, instantly destroys his ability to commute to a job to earn the money he owes. It is a perfectly irrational, punitive loop.
And if he still can't pay, they throw him in jail for civil contempt. The essay cites the Supreme Court case Turner v. Rogers, which confirmed that a man doesn't even have a categorical right to a state-appointed lawyer when he's being jailed for non-payment of child support.
Work perfectly summarizes this horrifying sequence. The state priced the father's presence at zero. It paid for his absence. It raided the bedroom to enforce the bargain.
And then it monetized his absence through a debt that survives every conceivable human misfortune, enforced by instruments that consume his physical liberty without the right to counsel.
I look at all this and I have to ask the same question Work poses. What does this mean about the bureaucrats running this? Were they sitting in smoke-filled rooms, cackling, actively trying to destroy the American family?
According to the author, no. And this is the most terrifying part of his thesis. This isn't a conspiracy. This is the inherent tragedy of the ledger.
Because bureaucracies, by definition, can only see what they can measure in their columns.
They measured cash support. That was a column they could track. But they had no column in their ledger to measure a father's daily presence.
They couldn't measure his discipline, his physical protection of the household, his mentoring of other kids in the neighborhood, his presence at the local volunteer fire department.
Because those things were unpriced in the ledger, the bureaucracy treated them as having a value of exactly zero.
It's accounting as destiny. A bureaucratic organism just seeks calories to grow, and its calories are its caseload. The ledger removed the men. The intellectual frame justified the removal.
And the resulting wreckage, the broken homes, the absent jailed fathers was then pointed to by society as proof that men were naturally defective. Look how they abandon their kids. Look how they end up in jail. We don't need them.
It completely closed the loop. But Work points out there's one more transmission mechanism here that is absolutely devastating, and it happens silently, inside the mind of the child. He points to the longitudinal research of Judith Wallerstein.
Yes. A 4-year-old child doesn't understand the intricacies of welfare eligibility rules. They don't understand the macroeconomic labor market or the immortal debt of the Bradley Amendment.
They only know their father is gone.
And a child processes that absence through the only causal system they possess at that age, themselves.
The child internalizes it as, if I were a better kid, if I were more lovable, he would have stayed.
Yeah.
The administrative state coldly enforced an accounting rule, but that rule was experienced by the child as unlove, and the unlove was billed directly to the child's own self-worth.
Millions of times, over decades, and no bureaucratic ledger anywhere recorded that psychological cost.
Which brings us to a massive turning point in the essay, because you have to wonder, didn't anyone inside the government see this happening in real time and try to stop it? Didn't the data sound an alarm?
Yes, someone did see it. In March 1965, an Assistant Secretary of Labor named Daniel Patrick Moynihan looked at the government's own vital statistics, and he panicked.
Moynihan wasn't some right-wing reactionary. He was an architect of LBJ's war on poverty. He was a man of the left.
And he wrote an internal report warning the administration that the family structure was collapsing at the bottom of American society.
Work explains what Moynihan saw in the data. Moynihan called it the scissors effect. Historically, for decades, family breakdown closely tracked with male unemployment.
When jobs dried up, families struggled. When jobs returned, families stabilized.
But suddenly, in the early 60s, the lines crossed like a pair of scissors. Welfare caseloads were rising steeply, even as male unemployment was dropping. The dissolution of the family had detached from economics. It had become self-sustaining.
Think back to the Soviet-Russia laboratory the author established earlier. When the Soviet instrument showed a falling birth rate in 1935, Stalin, as brutal as he was, reversed the policy. The totalitarian system responded to the bad data.
Moynihan was bringing the American system the exact same kind of catastrophic data.
But Work argues the American system had a defense mechanism the Soviets didn't, the frame. When Moynihan's report leaked to the press in the summer of 1965, he wasn't answered with policy changes. He was diagnosed.
A psychologist named William Ryan wrote a scathing response to Moynihan and coined a phrase that is now permanently embedded in our vocabulary: blaming the victim.
It's a tragic misreading of Moynihan's intent. Moynihan explicitly blamed slavery, Jim Crow, and systemic unemployment for the crisis. He was demanding massive New Deal-style national jobs programs for men.
But the frame didn't care. The intellectuals declared that to merely document the dissolution of the family was to defame its victims. Moynihan was painted as a racist and a bigot.
It's the Kingsley Newman well poisoning playing out on the national stage. They didn't debate Moynihan's data. They reclassified him as a bad person.
And the essay shows how the chilling effect was absolute. Mainstream sociology basically abandoned the study of family structure and poverty for 20 years.
As the prominent scholar William Julius Wilson later noted, the field vacated the most important social fact of the era because the intellectual frame made it unspeakable.
The Soviet system without the frame changed course. The American system with the frame just smashed the gauge.
And because they broke the gauge, Work argues we are now forced to look at what he calls the harvest. Let's look at the numbers.
Moynihan panicked in 1965 when the black non-marital birth ratio was approaching 25%. He thought it was a national emergency. Today, half a century later, the national ratio for all American births is roughly 40%.
The black ratio is over 70%, and the white ratio, which was around 3% in Moynihan's time, is now over 29%.
The author uses these numbers to make a vital point. This proves it isn't a culture-bound pathology. It isn't about race. The experiment replicated across every single population exposed to it. The systemic deterrence worked universally.
And Work points out we now have the data on what that deterrence actually cost the kids. He cites Sarah McClanahan, a liberal scholar who set out in the 1980s to prove that single motherhood was perfectly fine and that the two-parent orthodoxy was just a conservative myth.
But she looked at the data and had the intellectual honesty to admit she was wrong. She found that children raised apart from a parent are twice as likely to drop out of school and twice as likely to become teen mothers, regardless of income, race, or education level.
Then the essay brings in Raj Chetty's massive modern data studies out of Harvard, mapping economic mobility. Chetty inadvertently found the missing column in the ledger.
Right. He found that poor boys rise out of poverty significantly faster if they live in a neighborhood with a high share of fathers present. And that effect holds true even if the boy's own father is absent.
According to the essay, the father is literally neighborhood infrastructure. His presence radiates out to the street, providing a protective, mentoring effect that benefits other people's kids.
Exactly. And Work provides a final piece of harvest data to illustrate this community-wide collapse: the volunteer fire service. This is the ultimate expression of the protector class.
The guy who wakes up at 3 a.m. to run into a burning building for free. Volunteer firefighters have been in steep, uninterrupted decline for 4 decades, while call volumes have tripled. The protector class is physically emptying out of the towns.
Senator Moynihan had another famous concept he coined later in life, in 1993, defining deviancy down. Society gets so used to the pathology, so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the wreckage, that we just reclassify a broken system as the new normal.
We look at the empty firehouses, the fatherless streets, and the staggering non-marital birth rates, and we just shrug. We assume it's just the natural weather of modern life.
Which brings us back to the Watchers. The author connects this entire historical deep dive directly to the young man of today.
We spend so much time in the media talking about the crisis of young men. Failure to launch. Guys refusing to marry, refusing to commit, refusing to volunteer, just playing video games, and seemingly withdrawing from society.
We usually diagnose that withdrawal as a mysterious generational laziness, or we call it a virus of weakness or extended adolescence. But the author says we are looking at it wrong. We have to look at these young men as the watchers of the drone strike.
These young men have spent their entire lives seeing the second strike land on the men who tried to be protectors.
Let's trace what they saw. They saw the fathers mathematically priced out of homes by the welfare state. They saw men financially ruined by the unpayable debts of the Bradley Amendment.
They saw the traditional patriarch mocked in pop culture and in every university classroom as inherently toxic or bumbling.
They saw men dragged through a family court system where their kids could be made occasional visitors in their lives through proceedings they didn't even initiate.
So Work argues, when a young man looks at that landscape and declines to step into the role, it is not an inexplicable failure of nerve. It is the aggregate of millions of individually rational decisions.
They are essentially accountants who looked at the contract for the pressure role, saw that the terms were legally and financially suicidal, and refused to sign.
Now, I have to ask, is the author letting men off the hook here? Is he excusing the guy playing video games in his mom's basement?
No, the text is very clear that this is an explanation, not an excuse. It's a structural diagnosis. The deterrent signal was sent at full institutional volume for decades, and the tragedy is that deterrent signals work.
The Waziri father waiting at the edge of the rubble in Pakistan wasn't a coward. He computed the lesson correctly. Work is arguing that the American man, unmarried at 35, absent from the parish council and the firehouse, has computed the exact same lesson.
The price of the protector role is unpayable, and no institution will stand with the man who pays it.
But the system can never admit that it caused this outcome, so it does exactly what the intellectual frame always does. It diagnoses the withdrawal caused by the system as further proof of male defectiveness.
Yes, the system looks at these young men withdrawing and diagnoses them with toxic passivity or fragile masculinity. It creates new bureaucratic programs and new ledgers to treat the very disease that the bureaucracy itself caused.
The loop seals itself against any internal correction.
As I read this, the system runs so perfectly, so ruthlessly, and with such devastating efficiency that it almost feels coordinated. It feels like there has to be a smoke-filled room of supervillains orchestrating the destruction of the family.
But Work insists over and over again, there was no caucus, there was no conspiracy.
So how does a machine run so perfectly without a driver? Work attempts to answer this in an appendix to the essay, where he steps back to ask, whose purpose does this machine ultimately serve?
To answer that, he takes us into the legal history of the corporation. In the 13th century, Pope Innocent V defined the corporation as a persona a fictitious person. But he put a very specific theological limit on it. The corporation has no soul.
And because it has no soul, the medieval canon lawyers understood that it cannot be excommunicated, it cannot sin, and it has no conscience to feel guilt or be punished in the afterlife.
They allowed these entities to exist for commerce, but they kept them tightly caged.
But Work points out that modern law opened the cage. He points to a wild historical accident. The 1886 Supreme Court case, Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad.
The court didn't even actually rule on this specific point, but a court reporter, who happened to be a former railroad president, wrote a headnote claiming the Chief Justice said corporations had the constitutional rights of the 14th Amendment.
An amendment explicitly written to grant legal personhood and protection to freed slaves was captured to grant constitutional protections to soulless corporations.
Justice Hugo Black later noted that in its first 50 years, the 14th Amendment was invoked a fraction of a percent for freedmen, but more than half the time for corporations.
Then you add modern rulings like Citizens United, granting these entities unlimited political speech.
Work translates this legal history into a profound philosophical point. Western society has literally built and chartered entities that perfectly match the ancient theological concept of principalities and powers.
They are immortal by charter, incorporeal by definition, soulless by founding doctrine. They have infinite standing, unlimited megaphones, and are legally mandated to have a singular, insatiable appetite for their own growth.
So there was no conspiracy of evil social workers aiming to destroy the father. It's just the gravity of a soulless system. A government agency's budget depends on its caseload. Intact, resilient families equal a caseload of 0.
Therefore, the administrative machine inevitably seeks to absorb the family's functions to feed its own ledger. It needs calories.
At the human level, the destruction was executed by sincere people through blind instruments. But the instruments themselves are not human. The law built persons without souls, exercising dominion through human agents who individually just intend to do their jobs.
It is incredibly bleak. But this isn't a deep dive of despair. Work doesn't leave us at the edge of the rubble. He proposes a remedy. How do we break this loop?
To understand his remedy, we have to understand the author's own skin in the game. Stephen Sears' work reveals a deeply personal note at the end of the text. In 1987, while working as a highly successful scientist, he was subjected to an intense, covert workplace mobbing campaign.
He writes about how, suddenly and without explanation, the ground changed. Friendly acquaintances turned cold, small sabotages accumulated, a reputational frame was installed behind his back, painting him as difficult or unstable.
Because the well was poisoned, everything he did to defend himself only confirmed the audience's suspicions.
It took him decades to understand what happened to him, but the trauma of that invisible weapon taught him how to spot it happening on a civilizational scale to the protector class. He knows exactly how a frame files testimony as a symptom.
So what is his solution? He proposes 2 things. Administratively, we have to add the missing column.
If the problem is that bureaucracies only value what they price, Work argues we must rigorously score family policies for their effect on paternal presence. We have to repeal the marriage penalties and welfare formulas.
We have to dismantle the punitive architecture of the Bradley Amendment and restore child support to a natural obligation that a man can actually discharge, rather than a debt trap that consumes his livelihood.
But policy changes alone aren't enough. The author knows you can never out-argue a frame. The system will just adapt and pathologize the new policy, so he draws his ultimate call to action from Cardinal Newman.
When Newman was smeared by Kingsley, he didn't try to win a debate. He laid his entire life bare in his Apologia. He outlived the frame with undeniable testimony.
The ultimate counter-lesson to the deterrence signal must be lived. You cannot issue a memo to fix this because administrative agencies issuing memos are exactly what the watchers are suspicious of.
The men who calculate the cost, who see the deterrence signal, must choose to take the role anyway. The author writes this incredible call to arms. Marry, stay, mentor the neighbor's kid, join the graying volunteer fire company, run toward the collapse with the price fully known.
Because every man who does that is publishing, in daylight, where the watchers can read it, the only proposition that reverses the second strikes arithmetic, that the price is payable and it is being paid by men who counted the cost first. The author's final command is simple. Do not stand at the edge of the rubble. Dig and be seen digging.
And that wraps up our deep dive into Stephen Sears' works, Killing the Rescuer. We traveled from the grim, calculated logic of drone strikes in Pakistan to the massive social engineering laboratories of 1920s Soviet Russia, all the way to modern American bureaucratic accounting.
We unpacked how, according to the text, a society can become systemically blind to the value of its protectors, using a ledger that prices fathers at zero and a psychological frame that pathologizes their defense.
We've seen how work theorizes this mechanism operates not through malicious conspiracy, but through the blind gravity of soulless administrative principalities. And we've seen the harvest it yields, the withdrawal of young men standing at the edge of the rubble.
I want to leave you with one last thought to mull over. Building on everything we've discussed today from the source material, we spend so much time in our culture talking about disruption, disrupting industries, disrupting social norms, tearing down the establishment, breaking the old ways.
Right.
But if the massive, soulless administrative establishment we live under is fundamentally designed to isolate you, atomize you, and erase the traditional family to feed its own caseloads, then maybe the ultimate act of countercultural rebellion today isn't tearing something down.
Maybe the most radical punk rock thing you can possibly do in the 21st century is to simply plant your feet, commit to your neighbors, build a resilient family, and refuse to be priced out of your own home.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.